38 children entered Rissberg Castle in the 10th century. 33 would die screaming. The 5 who survived were not meant to be heroes. They were experiments, failures, according to the mages who created them. Beings with just enough power to kill monsters, but not enough to matter in the grander schemes of sorcery. Disposable tools forged from the bodies of children who had no choice, no voice, no escape. Their creators would call them witchers. History would forget their names. Remember only the white-haired legend who came centuries later, the songs about tossed coins and Valley of Plenty. But long before Geralt of Rivia walked the path, long before Kaer Morhen stood as a monument to what was lost, there were the first, the ones who survived when they should have died, the ones who proved that humans could be transformed into something capable of standing against the nightmares that came through the conjunction, and the ones who paid for that proof with everything they were. This is how they were made. The world remembers its monsters. It does not remember what came before them. The years when twilight held less dread, when most forest paths led where they were meant to lead, when children vanished less frequently, and mothers woke to fewer screams that ended too abruptly in the dark. The conjunction changed this. Reality tore. What had been separate collapsed into singularity. The barriers between worlds, those ancient membranes that had held for epochs uncounted, simply ceased. Whether through catastrophic magical accident or the slow erosion of cosmic structure remains unclear. Accounts from those who witnessed it differ wildly. Some survivors experienced what felt like days of chaos. Others insisted the entire event occupied no more than a few minutes. Whether this represents actual temporal distortion or the unreliability of traumatized memory can't be known. What is certain, when the conjunction ended, the world that emerged bore little resemblance to what had existed before. Monsters walked the continent, not the beasts that had always existed, wolves, bears, the natural predators that humans and elder races had long understood. These were creatures fundamentally incompatible with the laws governing this reality, things with too many limbs or none at all, entities that defied basic principles of biology, that seemed to exist partially in multiple states simultaneously, predators whose very presence caused reality to fray at its edges. Drowners emerged from waters that had been safe for generations. Ghouls began to cluster where the dead were laid to rest. Creatures that would come to be called neckers swarmed from underground warrens, overwhelming settlements in waves of chittering hunger. In the forests, things that resembled trees began to move, to hunt, to kill with methodical patience. The folk who survived encounters with these beings whispered of Leshens, though the name would not solidify for decades. Villages disappeared, not abandoned, not burned by raiders or consumed by plague, simply gone, as if every living soul had been lifted from existence, leaving only empty homes and meals half-eaten on tables. Search parties sent to investigate often did not return. Those that did brought back accounts of things glimpsed in peripheral vision, of sounds that should not exist, of spaces where natural laws seemed negotiable. The early human kingdoms, still struggling to establish themselves on the continent after arriving during the conjunction, faced a crisis of survival. The elder races, elves, dwarves, gnomes, possessed millennia of accumulated knowledge and magical tradition. They adapted, though not without terrible cost. But humans, newcomers with neither deep magical understanding nor the long memory of the elder races, died in numbers that threatened their tenuous foothold on this world. Soldiers proved inadequate. A man with a sword, however skilled, however brave, could not fight what he could not comprehend. Conventional tactics failed against enemies that regenerated from wounds, that attacked from impossible angles, that sometimes were not entirely present in physical space. Entire companies of trained warriors would march into a forest and fail to return. The few survivors spoke of battles where steel passed through flesh without effect, where shields provided no protection against claws that seemed to exist partially in another reality. Magic users understood more than soldiers. Sorcerers and sorceresses, those who had learned to manipulate the chaos that now flowed more freely through the world, recognized these creatures as entities from other spheres of existence, beings that operated under different fundamental principles. But even powerful mages found themselves limited. Each monster required individual study, specific countermeasures, resources and time that could not be spared when entire regions faced depopulation. The northern kingdoms began to fracture under the pressure. Trade routes became impassable. Isolated settlements fell silent. Refugees flooded into walled cities, straining resources past breaking. Food production collapsed in regions where farmers could not safely work their fields. The careful political structures humans had been building since the conjunction began to crumble, not from internal conflict but from the simple mathematics of unsustainable population loss. It was in this context that certain mages began to consider alternatives. If conventional warriors could not fight these creatures, if even trained battle mages found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer variety and number of otherworldly threats, then perhaps the solution lay not in refining existing approaches but in creating something entirely new. Something that combined human adaptability with the supernatural nature of the threats themselves. A hybrid of natural and unnatural, capable of bridging the gap between mundane and monstrous. The concept was not revolutionary in its origin. Mages had been experimenting with biological modification for centuries. The creation of new creatures through magical manipulation of existing forms was an established, if controversial, field of study. What would come to be called hybridization had produced everything from enhanced livestock to magical constructs designed for specific purposes. But creating intelligent beings capable of independent thought and action, beings that could hunt and kill the monsters now plaguing the continent, this represented something different. Not mere modification of existing creatures, but the fundamental transformation of human children into living weapons designed specifically to combat entities from other realities. The ethics of such an endeavor were debatable. The necessity in that moment seemed absolute. Cosimo Malaspina arrived at this conclusion through careful observation rather than sudden revelation. An accomplished mage specializing in genetic modification and mutation, Malaspina had spent decades studying the principles by which living organisms could be altered. His work at Rissberg Castle, that ancient fortress that housed some of the most advanced magical research on the continent, had produced numerous hybridized creatures. Some had proven useful, others had escaped, adding to the catalog of dangerous entities now threatening human survival. Malaspina understood that solving the monster crisis required more than creating another predator to loose upon the world. It required intelligence, strategy, the capacity to learn and adapt. It required, in essence, transforming humans into something capable of fighting monsters on equal terms while retaining the cognitive abilities that made humans effective problem solvers. His student, Alzur, would become the primary architect of this vision. Accounts of Alzur's early life are fragmentary. What drove him toward the specific focus on mutation and hybridization remains subject to interpretation. Some records suggest personal tragedy, perhaps a loved one killed by a monster he could not fight. Others indicate pure scholarly ambition, a desire to push the boundaries of what magical biology could achieve. Based on what fragmentary evidence survives, the truth likely encompasses both motivations, though the specific details have been obscured by time and deliberate myth-making. What is documented? Alzur proved exceptionally skilled at the work Malaspina had pioneered. Together, teacher and student began to refine the theoretical framework for creating what they initially conceptualized as a new order of monster hunters. Not mages, not soldiers, but something between. Beings enhanced through alchemical mutation to possess abilities that would allow them to combat supernatural threats. The technical challenges were formidable. Simply injecting mutagenic compounds into human subjects proved fatal in early experiments. Adult physiology, already fully developed, rejected the transformations with catastrophic results. Test subjects died in agony as their bodies tried to simultaneously maintain human form and incorporate fundamentally incompatible biological changes. Children, Malaspina and Alzur theorized, might prove more malleable. From what can be inferred from their subsequent experimental choices, a developing body, still in the process of establishing its final form, could potentially integrate mutations that would kill an adult. The ethical implications of using children for such experiments were acknowledged and dismissed as secondary to necessity. At least, this appears to be how the mages rationalized their decision, given that the practice continued across generations. The kingdoms needed a solution. Thousands were dying. The arithmetic suggested that if sacrificing dozens of children in experiments could produce a class of effective monster hunters, the immediate crisis might justify the cost. This reasoning would echo through the centuries, repeated by those who continued the work long after Malaspina and Alzur had passed from living memory. The collection of subjects began in the 10th century. Alzur traveled for weeks, moving through the northern kingdoms, gathering children. The exact methods of collection remain uncertain. as no complete records of this process survived. What evidence exists suggests the mages may have worked through intermediaries, purchasing orphans from foundling houses, or street children from desperate guardians. Other fragmentary accounts indicate less consensual acquisition, children taken from families unable to refuse mages acting with royal sanction. The truth likely varied by circumstance and region. 38 children arrived at Rissberg Castle, the fortress built centuries earlier by elven mages and later seized by humans, had become a center for experimental magic. Its remote location in the mountains provided isolation necessary for controversial research. The mages working there operated with tacit approval from the northern kingdoms. Their experiments tolerated in exchange for the possibility of breakthrough discoveries that might aid human survival. The children were young, most between 7 and 10 years old, some younger. The logic was sound from an experimental perspective. Younger subjects would theoretically prove more adaptable to mutagenic transformation. From a practical standpoint, it ensured the children would have time to be trained in combat, alchemy, and monster lore, even as their bodies were being fundamentally altered. Training began before the experiments. The children learned to wield swords, though most could barely lift the practice weapons provided. They studied basic alchemy, memorizing the names and properties of herbs they would later be expected to gather and combine into potions. They received instruction in tracking, stealth, survival in wilderness conditions. Monster lore was drilled into them through endless repetition. The identifying characteristics of different species, their weaknesses, their behavioral patterns. It was brutal preparation for children so young. They trained from dawn until exhaustion forced them to collapse. Food was adequate for physical development, but provided no comfort. Sleep came in narrow bunks in cold stone chambers. The instructors showed no mercy, no gentleness. These children were not being raised. They were being forged, the human softness beaten out of them through relentless conditioning. 4 children died during this initial training period, not from the mutations. Those had not yet begun. They died from the training itself, accidents during weapons practice, falls from climbing exercises. One succumbed to illness the harsh conditions had exacerbated. The surviving children learned to bury their dead quickly and continue without pause. Grief was a luxury they could not afford. Weakness invited further suffering. The survivors, traumatized and hardened by weeks of inhuman preparation, formed bonds despite the conditions designed to isolate them. Among them was Erland, a child from Larvik in the Skellige Isles. He found companionship with a girl named Jagoda from Aedern. They would sit together when opportunity allowed, speaking quietly about their situations, about the impossibility of escape, about fears neither could voice to the cold-eyed mages who watched their every movement. These stolen moments of human connection became crucial to maintaining some fragment of identity amid systematic dehumanization. Other children formed similar alliances, temporary partnerships that helped them endure. The mages did not discourage these bonds. Isolated, broken individuals would prove useless as monster hunters. They needed subjects capable of functioning, of maintaining psychological cohesion even as their bodies were being transformed into something no longer entirely human. The real experiments began when the mages determined the children had been sufficiently conditioned. What came to be known as the Trial of the Grasses represented the first and most crucial transformation. The process took approximately 1 week, though for those undergoing it, time became meaningless. The children were restrained on tables in the laboratory chambers beneath Rissberg. Thick leather straps held them immobile. What followed was not surgery in any conventional sense, but alchemical transformation, conducted through the introduction of foreign substances directly into their developing bodies. The specific compounds varied as the mages refined their formulas, but certain elements remained consistent. Herbal preparations formed the foundation, decoctions of corn lily, nightshade, speargrass, wild rye, and wolfsbane, each selected for properties that would prepare the body for what came next. These were administered as teas initially, inducing paralysis and metabolic changes that made the subjects more receptive to mutation. Then came the mutagenic elixirs. The base consisted of albumin extracted from gray scolopendromorphs, those massive centipede-like creatures whose venom possessed unique properties that could induce cellular transformation. To this were added essences harvested from various monsters, cultures of viruses that had been carefully bred and modified, and alchemical catalysts whose exact composition the mages guarded obsessively. These compounds were injected directly into the bloodstream. The pain was indescribable. The children's bodies rejected the foreign substances violently. Most died by the third day. Their organs failed as human biology proved incompatible with the changes being forced upon it. Hearts burst from the strain. Kidneys shut down as toxins accumulated faster than natural processes could eliminate them. Brains swelled against skulls, causing hemorrhages that killed instantly, or left subjects brain dead and twitching. Those who survived the third day entered a stupor that lasted until the seventh. They convulsed, vomited blood and bile, sweated through fevers that should have killed them. The mages maintained careful watch, administering counteragents when transformations proceeded too rapidly, introducing additional stressors when bodies adapted too effectively to the initial assault. The goal was not comfort, but successful mutation, keeping subjects alive while fundamentally rewriting their biology. The survival rate stabilized at approximately 3 in 10. Of the 38 children who arrived at Rissberg, 4 had died during training. Of the 34 who underwent the trial of the grasses, 29 died screaming on those tables or in the fevered stupor that followed. 5 boys survived. Erland was among them. Jagoda was not. When Erland woke on the 8th day, his eyes had changed. The irises had become vertically slitted, like a cat's, capable of dilating to capture available light in darkness. His reflexes had accelerated to the point where he could track and catch insects in flight. His body temperature had dropped several degrees below normal human range. The scent of the world had become overwhelming. He could identify individuals by smell alone, track prey by their sweat, detect poisons in food before tasting. But Jagoda's bunk remained empty. She had died on the 4th day. Her body, too small and too fragile, had simply torn itself apart from the inside as the mutations tried to take hold. Erland learned this without ceremony, without condolence. The mages recorded her death as data, one more failure in the ongoing refinement of their process. The 5 survivors, Erland and 4 others whose names have been lost to history, represented both success and profound disappointment to their creators. They had survived where others had died. Their bodies had accepted the mutations, integrated the foreign biology, emerged changed in ways that would allow them to fight monsters. But the transformation had not granted them the magical potential the mages had hoped for. They possessed more capacity than normal humans, enough to channel basic combat signs if properly trained, but nothing approaching the power of even a mediocre sorcerer. Most of the mages at Rissberg considered them failures. Useful failures, perhaps, capable of killing creatures that normal warriors could not touch, but still far short of the original vision of magic-using knights who could stand as equals to the elder race's greatest champions. The disappointed mages began to dismiss the survivors as witchers, a derogatory term implying they were capable of nothing more than crude witchery, simple tricks rather than true sorcery. The name stuck, but a few mages, Alzur chief among them, recognized value in what had been created. These beings were not the warriors of legend they had hoped to forge, but they were something the continent desperately needed. Survivors who could hunt monsters and live to hunt again. Imperfect tools, certainly, but tools that might serve the purpose for which they had been designed, even if they would never become the champions the mages had envisioned. The question became, what to do with them now? The Order of Witchers found its true home, not at Rissberg, but at Morgraig Castle. Disappointed with their limited magical potential, most of the mages at Rissberg wanted nothing further to do with the Witcher experiments. They turned their attention to other projects, other hybridization attempts that might yield more impressive results. But Alzur, along with his teacher Cosimo Malaspina and his own apprentice Erland of Larvik, believed the work remained valuable despite falling short of initial ambitions. These 3 mages, acting with continued support from various northern monarchs, desperate for solutions to the monster crisis, relocated their operation to Morgraig Castle in the Kestrel Mountains. The abandoned fortress provided space for the expanded work they envisioned, not just creating witchers, but properly training them, refining the mutations, establishing what might become a self-sustaining order. The first 5 witchers came with them. At Morgraig, the real work of creating a functional class of monster hunters began. The mutations had granted physical capabilities, but those meant nothing without proper training and knowledge. The witchers needed to learn not just how to fight, but how to think, how to identify creatures, exploit weaknesses, adapt to situations no amount of physical enhancement could overcome through strength alone. Instructors were recruited from across the northern kingdoms. Master hunters taught tracking, fieldcraft, the patterns by which different creatures could be located and engaged on favorable terms. Alchemists provided deep training in potion making, expanding far beyond the basic herb lore the children had received at Rissberg. Swordmasters drilled the witchers in techniques adapted specifically for their enhanced reflexes and strength, fighting styles that leveraged their mutations, rather than treating them as normal warriors. But the most crucial development came from Cosimo Malaspina himself. The old mage, watching his creation struggle to channel even basic magical energies, developed a simplified system of spellcasting, specifically designed for beings with limited magical talent. What came to be called signs represented stripped-down versions of proper spells, crude but effective combat magic that could be learned through repetition and muscle memory, rather than deep understanding of magical theory. Ard, a telekinetic blast of force. Igni, a gout of flame from the palm. Yrden, a magical trap inscribed on surfaces. Quen, a protective shield drawn around the body. Axi, a mental compulsion affecting weak minds. These signs would never rival what a trained sorcerer could achieve. They were limited, draining, requiring focus and energy that more powerful mages expended effortlessly. But for the witchers, they represented tools that could mean the difference between life and death when facing creatures immune to conventional weapons. The training continued for months. Additional subjects arrived, more children collected through methods that remained deliberately undocumented. More trials were conducted, the formulas refined slightly with each iteration as the mages learned from previous failures. The survival rate remained brutally low, but survivors began to accumulate. A dozen witchers, then 15, then 20. Those who survived and completed their training were released onto the path in their mid-teens, sent out to take contracts, to hunt, to prove the concept that humans could be transformed into effective monster hunters. They proved effective. Reports began filtering back to Morgraig. Witchers had cleared a leshen from contested territory. A witcher had eliminated a cockatrice that had been terrorizing river traffic. 3 witchers working together had destroyed a griffin nest that had resisted military assault. The enhanced hunters were expensive to create, required years of investment, and most candidates died before completing transformation. But those who survived earned their keep. The northern kingdoms, watching this, continued their support. More funding, more children, more authorization to continue experiments that might have faced stronger opposition during more stable times. The crisis created permissiveness. The results, however imperfect, justified continued investment. Then, months before the first generation of witchers were to set out on the path, their sword trainer was replaced by a knight-errant the mages had encountered during their travels. Taliesin Bledin Yorath ep Llewellyn arrived at Morgraig bearing a black shield emblazoned with a griffin. The witchers, struggling with the unwieldy formality of his name, simply called him Griffin. He was unlike the other instructors, not hired for specific skills but driven by personal conviction that these young hunters represented something important. Griffin taught them southern sword styles that complemented their enhanced speed and strength, but more significantly, he spoke to them about purpose, about duty, about the fact that they had been created for a reason beyond simply killing monsters for coin. These words resonated particularly strongly with Erland, the young witcher from Larvik, still carrying the weight of Jagoda's death and the deaths of so many others, found in Griffin's philosophy something that helped make sense of the horror they had endured. They had not suffered for nothing. They were not merely failed experiments or disposable tools. They were protectors, guardians who stood between the innocent and the darkness, precisely because they were capable of enduring what others could not. This philosophy would shape everything Erland later created. In the years that followed, as more witchers were created and trained, a pattern emerged. They would set out on the path in spring, traveling the continent, taking contracts. They would return to Morgraig in winter, sharing knowledge, training, maintaining the bonds that helped them endure the isolation of their profession. A culture began to develop, rough and practical, marked by dark humor and emotional distance, but genuine nonetheless. These were not the knights the mages had originally envisioned, but they were brothers, bound by shared trauma and shared purpose. Then Alzur and the founding mages departed. The reasons remain unclear, as the mages left no documented explanation for their decision. Based on the timing and subsequent events, several interpretations suggest themselves. Perhaps they felt the order had become sufficiently established to function without their direct oversight. Perhaps other research demanded their attention. Alzur was known to have continued creating new creatures and spells after his Witcher work. Perhaps they simply tired of the work, the endless cycle of dead children and marginal improvements, the weight of having created beings who would outlive them while bearing the scars of their experiments. Without direct testimony, any explanation remains inference drawn from fragmentary evidence. Whatever their motivations, Alzur, Cosimo Malaspina, and Idaran of Olivo left Morgraig, leaving behind only a handful of mages capable of performing the mutations, but none with the authority or vision to lead the order as a unified organization. The Witchers were left to govern themselves. For a time this worked. The continent was vast. Contracts were plentiful. Witchers could range across territories without competing for work, maintaining professional courtesy because abundance made cooperation possible. They gathered at Morgraig each winter, sharing techniques and knowledge, maintaining the illusion of organizational cohesion. But tensions existed beneath the surface. Different Witchers held different philosophies about their purpose and methods. Some, following Griffin's teachings, believed they had a duty to protect people even when payment proved inadequate. Others, bitter about their creation and transformation, viewed contracts as purely transactional. No coin, no service. Some maintained emotional distance from those they protected, while others sought connection despite the barriers their mutations created. As long as work remained plentiful, these differences remained manageable. But as Witcher numbers grew and as the immediate post-conjunction crisis began to ease, competition for contracts increased. What had been philosophical differences became practical disputes. Witchers began undercutting each other, accepting lower payments to secure contracts. Others responded by threatening rivals, demanding they move on to different territories. Trust eroded. The winter gatherings became tense rather than collegial. The first serious violence occurred over a contract involving a creature called a chort. Two Witchers, Arnagad and Rhys, both claimed right to the hunt. The details of their dispute have not survived clearly in the records. Conflicting accounts provide different versions of who arrived first, who had prior claim, who escalated the confrontation to physical violence. What documentary evidence suggests Arnagad attacked Rhys with lethal intent, leaving him severely wounded and barely alive. The underlying causes, whether personal animosity, genuine dispute over contract rights, or broader frustrations with the Order's dysfunction, cannot be determined with certainty from what remains. But Arnagad knew what would follow. The other Witchers at Morgraig would demand justice, perhaps execution, perhaps permanent exile, perhaps something worse. Rather than face that judgment, Arnagad gathered a group of Witchers loyal to him, those who shared his harder philosophy, who believed the weak deserved neither protection nor consideration. They returned to Morgraig not in submission but as a war party. The battle that followed was brief and brutal. Witchers fighting Witchers, enhanced reflexes and strength, turned against those who shared the same mutations. The defenders of Morgraig had numbers. Arnagad's faction had cohesion and willingness to kill without hesitation. Arnagad's group was defeated but not destroyed. They escaped into the mountains, several dead on both sides. Morgraig's halls stained with blood that would never fully wash away. The survivors fled north to the Amel Mountains, where Arnagad established what would become the School of the Bear. He built his school on principles of independence and pragmatism. Bear Witchers would maintain emotional distance, train harder than any others, rely on strength and endurance, rather than the knightly philosophy Griffin had taught. They would take contracts for coin and nothing else. Sentiment, in Arnagad's view, was weakness that got Witchers killed. The Order of Witchers had fractured. Other schisms followed, each driven by different philosophies and grievances. Ivar Evil Eye, disillusioned with the Order's lack of discipline and structure, gathered followers and traveled east beyond the Amel Peaks. There he established what would become the School of the Viper, built on principles of absolute professionalism and cold precision. Viper Witchers would become known for accepting assassination contracts alongside monster hunts, blurring the line between hunter and hired killer. 20 younger Witchers, frustrated with the limitations the founding mages had placed on advancing the mutations, stole compounds and research notes from Morgraig's laboratories. They scattered, eventually coalescing into what became the School of the Cat. Cat Witchers would push the mutations further than any others, seeking greater speed and reflexes even at the cost of psychological stability. Many cat witchers descended into madness. Those who maintained sanity became arguably the deadliest fighters among all witcher schools. Erland of Larvik, now in his 40s and one of the eldest surviving witchers, watched Morgraig tear itself apart and chose a different path. He gathered 13 others who shared his philosophy, those who still believed in Griffin's teachings about duty and protection, who thought witchers could be more than mercenaries despite everything that had been done to them. They departed Morgraig peacefully, traveling northwest to the kingdom of Kovir and Povis. There they discovered Kaer Morhen. The keep had once housed Alzur and his fellow mages during early experimentation. It had been abandoned after those experiments failed catastrophically, leaving the halls haunted by the spectral remnants of subjects who had died in agony. Erland and his companions cleared the spirits through days of fighting, claimed the fortress, and established what would become the School of the Griffin. Griffin witchers would maintain the strictest adherence to the original ideals the order had aspired to: neutrality in political conflicts, protection of the innocent, honor in contracts. They would be scorned by other schools as naive idealists, but they persisted in believing their suffering had meaning, that they were not merely mistakes, but had purpose. The remaining witchers at Morgraig, those who had not followed Arnagad, Ivar, the cat founders, or Erland, found themselves in a fortress that no longer felt like home. The halls held too many ghosts now. The workshops where children had died reminded them of costs they could no longer rationalize. The winter gatherings had become bitter affairs marked by accusation and recrimination. Without the founding mages, without unified leadership, without the bonds that had once held them together, Morgraig offered nothing but painful memories. They abandoned the castle. Traveling far east into Cadwyn, they discovered ancient elven ruins in the mountains. There they established Kaer Morhen, the keep of the Elder Sea. This would become the School of the Wolf, maintaining a middle path between the extremes of bear pragmatism and Griffin idealism. Wolf witchers would honor contracts and charge fairly, would maintain neutrality but not refuse help when circumstances warranted, would train rigorously but without the crushing brutality Arnagad demanded. The Order of Witchers had ended. In its place stood independent schools, each pursuing variations on the original concept, each claiming to represent the true purpose of what witchers should be. They would remain separate for centuries, occasionally cooperating but never reuniting. The vision of a unified order of monster hunters had died at Morgraig, fractured by philosophy and violence into traditions that would persist in isolation until external forces destroyed them entirely. The trial of the grasses that killed Jagoda and so many others became standardized across the Witcher schools, though each introduced variations reflecting their philosophies. The basic process remained largely unchanged from what Alzur and Malaspina had developed. Children between 7 and 12 were subjected to alchemical transformation designed to fundamentally alter their biology. The procedure took approximately 1 week from beginning to end, assuming the subject survived. The specific methodology was brutal in its precision. Subjects were restrained on tables in laboratory chambers. Thick leather straps held them immobile, not primarily to prevent escape, but to keep them from injuring themselves during convulsions. What followed was carefully calculated to push developing bodies to the absolute edge of what they could endure without dying. The herbal preparations came first. Decoctions of corn lily, nightshade, speargrass, wildry, and wolfsbane were administered as teas over the course of several hours. These induced paralysis and began the metabolic changes that would make subjects receptive to the mutations that followed. The children remained conscious through this phase, aware and terrified, but unable to move or cry out. Then the mutagenic compounds were introduced directly into the bloodstream. The base consisted of albumin extracted from gray scolopendromorphs, those massive centipede creatures whose venom possessed unique mutagenic properties. To this were added essences harvested from various monsters, carefully cultured viruses, and alchemical catalysts whose exact compositions varied by school and were regarded as precious secrets. These substances fundamentally rewrote human biology. The process was not gentle transformation, but violent rejection followed by forced acceptance. The body recognized the foreign compounds as poison and tried to purge them. This triggered the deaths that occurred most frequently on the third day. Subjects simply tore themselves apart from within, as human physiology proved incompatible with what was being forced into it. Hearts burst, kidneys failed, brains hemorrhaged, eyes ruptured, blood vessels collapsed. Some children died screaming, others simply stopped breathing, their autonomic systems overwhelmed by competing biological imperatives. The mages who conducted the trials recorded these deaths as data points, refining their formulas based on which children died, how, and when. Those who survived the third day entered a stupor that lasted until the seventh. They lay motionless except for occasional convulsions. They vomited blood and bile. They sweated through fevers that should have killed them, their temperatures spiking high enough to cook brain tissue. The attending mages administered counteragents when transformations proceeded too rapidly, introduced additional stressors when bodies adapted too effectively to the initial assault. The goal was not the subject's comfort, but successful mutation. They needed to keep children alive while fundamentally rewriting their biology. This required a delicate balance, enough stress to force transformation, not so much that the body simply gave up and died. The survival rate across all schools remained approximately 3 in 10. For every 3 boys who woke on the 8th day with cat eyes and enhanced reflexes, 7 died on the tables or in fever delirium. The schools accepted this as the cost of producing effective monster hunters. They had to, because no one had discovered how to improve those odds significantly despite decades of refinement. Those who survived the trial of the grasses found themselves fundamentally changed. Their eyes had become vertically slitted and capable of extreme dilation, allowing them to see in near complete darkness. Their reflexes had accelerated to the point where they could track arrows in flight. Their strength had increased to levels that allowed them to wield weapons no normal human could lift effectively. Their healing had accelerated dramatically. Injuries that would kill or cripple normal humans became survivable, even if the process of healing remained agonizing. But the trial of the grasses was only the beginning. Additional mutations followed for those deemed suitable. The trial of dreams targeted the nervous system and hormonal balance, further enhancing senses while simultaneously dampening emotional responses. This was considered necessary. Witchers needed to function in situations that would break normal humans psychologically. The reduction in emotional range helped, though it came at the cost of making genuine human connection difficult, even when witchers sought it. The trial of mountains came last, testing practical survival skills in conditions designed to kill. Many who had survived the alchemical transformations died here, killed not by the mutations but by inexperience or bad luck, or the simple reality that enhanced bodies meant nothing if the mind failed under pressure. Each school developed slightly different approaches to these trials, reflecting their philosophical differences. The Griffin school, following Erland's conviction that their suffering had to mean something, emphasized the nobility of their purpose during training. Griffin witchers were taught they were guardians and protectors, that they endured the trials so others would not have to face monsters alone. This provided psychological scaffolding that helped many survive where others might have given up, but it also created witchers who struggled deeply when the world proved less grateful than their training had led them to expect. The Bear School, shaped by Arnegad's brutal pragmatism, stripped away such comforting narratives. Bear witchers were taught they were weapons, nothing more. They survived because they were strong enough, and those who were not strong enough deserved to die. This produced witchers of exceptional hardiness and skill, but it also created men who often struggled to find meaning in their existence beyond the next contract, the next fight, the next winter when they could rest before doing it all again. The cat school pushed the mutations further than any others, seeking advantages in speed and reflexes even when it meant accepting greater psychological instability. Cat witchers were faster and deadlier than any others, but many descended into madness or sociopathy. The school developed a reputation for producing witchers as dangerous to innocent people as to monsters, though those cat witchers who maintained their sanity were among the finest hunters ever created. The wolf school, established by those who left Morgraig, tried to find balance. Wolf witchers received training that emphasized both competence and ethical consideration, neither pure idealism nor pure pragmatism. They were taught to honor contracts, but also to recognize when circumstances demanded they act even without payment. This middle path produced witchers capable of functioning in the complex reality of the continent, though it also meant wolf witchers rarely felt entirely comfortable with the choices their profession demanded. The Viper School, founded by Ivar Evil Eye, focused on absolute discipline and precision. Viper witchers underwent training that bordered on torture, designed to eliminate any weakness or hesitation. They became the most professional of all witchers, capable of executing contracts with mechanical efficiency. But this came at the cost of almost complete emotional detachment. Viper Witchers functioned superbly as tools, but struggled to exist as anything resembling whole people. Regardless of school, the knowledge required to conduct these trials was guarded obsessively. The alchemical formulas, the precise sequences of compounds, the timing and temperatures that made the difference between successful transformation and death, all of this existed only in the minds of the mages who performed the mutations, and in handwritten notes kept in heavily guarded laboratories. Each school developed slight variations on the original Alzur formulas. Each claimed their version was superior, and none shared their secrets with the outsiders. This paranoid hoarding of knowledge would prove catastrophic. By the late 12th century, Witchers had become an established feature of the northern kingdoms. Not common, the schools produced perhaps 2 or 3 new Witchers each year when they could acquire suitable subjects and conduct the trials successfully. But established, recognized, marginally accepted as necessary, if not welcomed. The monster populations that had exploded in the immediate aftermath of the conjunction had been driven back from populated areas. Not eliminated, monsters still killed people in the wilds, still threatened travelers and isolated settlements, but the existential crisis that had justified the creation of Witchers had passed. The kingdoms no longer faced depopulation, trade routes functioned, civilization had stabilized. This created complicated dynamics for those who remained. Witchers were still needed. Individual monsters continued killing people, and those deaths were no less tragic for occurring in smaller numbers than during the crisis period immediately following the conjunction. But the collective necessity that had once made the trials seem acceptable, if not justifiable, had diminished. Society's relationship with Witchers soured. The enhanced hunters had never been popular. Their appearance marked them as other. The cat-like eyes, the unnatural reflexes, the extended lifespans that meant they remained essentially unchanged, while normal humans aged and died around them. Their profession brought them into contact with the worst humanity encountered, left them covered in gore and speaking casually of horrors that haunted the nightmares of those they protected. But when monsters represented clear and present danger, Witchers were tolerated despite discomfort with what they were and how they had been created. Fear of supernatural predation outweighed distrust of those who hunted such threats. Necessity purchased acceptance, however grudging and conditional. As monster populations retreated to the wilds and encounters became less frequent in settled areas, that transaction no longer seemed worthwhile to many. Propaganda emerged that recast Witchers as parasites rather than protectors. Anonymous publications circulated throughout the northern kingdoms, the most infamous being a pamphlet titled Monstrum, or a description of a Witcher, which described the enhanced hunters as products of foul sorcery, abominations created through processes that violated natural and divine law, beings who should be eliminated rather than tolerated. The rhetoric found receptive audiences, peasants who had never directly encountered monsters, but had heard stories about Witchers began to view them as threats comparable to the creatures they hunted. The fact that Witchers charged for their services was reinterpreted as mercenary exploitation rather than reasonable compensation for dangerous work. Their emotional detachment, necessary for psychological survival, given what they faced regularly, was portrayed as inhuman coldness. Their modifications were framed as perversions of natural human form, rather than adaptations necessary for combat effectiveness. Religious authorities added theological condemnation. Witchers represented intervention in divine creation, the argument went. Humans had been made in specific form by higher powers, and the mutations that created Witchers violated this sacred design. The fact that many children died during the trials was offered as evidence that such transformations were fundamentally contrary to natural order. If the process were meant to succeed, it would not kill most who attempted it. The logic was circular and self-serving, but it provided moral justification for those seeking to act against Witchers. Hostility escalated from rhetoric to violence. Individual Witchers were attacked in towns where they sought contracts. Some were killed outright. Others were driven away by mobs before they could address the monster problems those same mobs had initially sought their help with. The schools found themselves increasingly isolated, their winter supplies cut off by communities that had previously traded freely. Then, in the year 1194, coordinated attacks struck multiple Witcher schools simultaneously. The assault on Kaer Morhen was the best documented. Peasants from surrounding regions, led by priests who preached that witchers were abominations against natural order, aided by mages whose identities were never conclusively established, attacked the school of the Wolf's Fortress in winter when most of its witchers were present. The attackers came in numbers that overwhelmed even enhanced reflexes and combat skill. They killed 23 witchers and 40 students. The students included children in various stages of training, some who had not yet undergone the trials, others who had survived the mutations but remained years away from completing their preparation, a few who might have been ready to depart on the path within seasons. All died. Instructors died. The mages who understood how to conduct the trials died, along with the accumulated knowledge they had not yet passed to apprentices. The attackers burned the laboratory facilities. Equipment carefully maintained across generations was destroyed. Alembics shattered. Retorts melted in fires set throughout the vaults where mutagenic compounds were stored. The written formulas, those painstakingly refined procedures that represented centuries of experimentation, were reduced to ash. Everything required to continue creating new witchers was eliminated in hours of violence driven by ideology that portrayed such elimination as righteous action. The mages who aided the attackers made the assault feasible. Their identities were never conclusively established, creating ongoing debate among those who study this period. Some accounts, though their reliability remains questionable, suggest renegade sorcerers acting from personal grievances against the Witcher schools. Others indicate organized Brotherhood involvement, though official records would later claim the attacks represented isolated incidents committed by fanatics without institutional support. Given the coordinated nature of the assaults and the magical expertise required, some degree of organized mage participation seems likely, but the truth remains obscured by contradictory testimonies and convenient gaps in documentation. Similar attacks struck other schools that same year. The Griffin school at Kaer Morhen was destroyed when avalanches, whether natural or magically induced, remains uncertain, buried the fortress entirely. The few Griffin witchers who survived were those absent on the path. They scattered, never reforming as a cohesive organization. The cat school fractured under assault, its scattered training facilities overrun. Some cat witchers survived by abandoning their medallions and identities, disappearing into society. Others retreated further into isolation, becoming increasingly unstable as the mutations they had pushed to extremes took psychological toll without the social structure that had previously contained their worst impulses. The Viper School was eliminated so thoroughly that even the location of their fortress was lost to history. Whether through coordinated attack or some other catastrophe, Viper Witchers simply ceased to exist as an organized force. Individual Vipers continued operating for decades, but without the ability to create new members, they were functionally extinct. The Bear School survived in the Amel Mountains, protected by geography and Arnegad's paranoid security measures, but even they lost the capability to conduct trials when their remaining mages were killed in a betrayal from within, details of which were never fully documented, but which left the school unable to create new witchers, even as the old ones slowly died to age and violence. Only those witchers absent from their schools during the attack survived. Vesemir had been present at Kaer Morhen, but survived through circumstances that accounts do not clearly specify. Various theories have been proposed based on fragmentary evidence. Perhaps he hid successfully during the initial assault. Perhaps he was thought dead and left among corpses while actually clinging to life. Perhaps the attackers showed selective mercy. The records provide no definitive answer. What is certain, Vesemir emerged as the sole survivor among those who had been at the fortress when violence erupted. He returned to find comprehensive destruction. Bodies of his brothers scattered throughout the keep, children he had trained lying dead in corridors, or still strapped to tables where they had been undergoing transformation when the mob arrived. The warm halls where generations of witchers had gathered during winter reduced to cold ruins. Everything that had made Kaer Morhen a living institution destroyed in a single night of organized hatred. Vesemir was a fencing instructor, not an alchemist or mage. He understood sword technique, combat tactics, physical conditioning, but the complex alchemical procedures required to prepare the mutagenic compounds, the precise formulations refined over generations, the magical oversight necessary to manage transformations, this knowledge had resided with the mages who were now dead. Vesemir could identify the herbs. He could operate basic equipment if it had survived intact, but he could not recreate the trials. The laboratory still existed in Kaer Morhen's vaults, damaged but not entirely destroyed. Jars of compounds sat on shelves, their potency slowly degrading with time and neglect. The herbs could still be gathered. They grew wild in mountains surrounding the fortress, but without knowing the correct sequences, the proper combinations, the exact timing and temperatures that made the difference between transformation and death, these materials were simply ingredients for poison rather than tools for creating witchers. Vesemir tried. He spent years attempting to reconstruct the formulas from memory, from fragments of notes that had survived the fires, from desperate experimentation. But alchemy at this level required precision beyond guesswork. Children who might have survived properly conducted trials died in agony when Vesemir's attempts went wrong. After several such failures, he stopped trying. The cost in young lives was too high even to him, even knowing that failure to continue the Witcher line meant eventual extinction. Other survivors faced similar situations. The few remaining Griffin Witchers possessed no alchemical knowledge. The scattered cats had lost their formulary specialists. The bears retained some understanding, but lacked the complete procedures. Individual Witchers across the continent found themselves in possession of partial knowledge that proved useless without the complete system. The knowledge chain was broken irreparably. A generation of Witchers had been created before 1194. These included some who would become legendary, Geralt of Rivia among them. Born in the previous decades when Kaer Morhen had still functioned fully, Geralt had undergone the trials successfully, had been subjected to additional experimental mutations that turned his hair white and enhanced his abilities beyond normal Witcher standards. But Geralt represented the end, not a continuation. The last generation. The final children transformed before the knowledge required for that transformation was destroyed beyond recovery. By the time Geralt walked the path in his prime, perhaps 24 Witchers remained across all schools combined. Old men with cat eyes and silver swords, growing slowly older, taking contracts in a world that increasingly viewed them as relics of a darker age. They trained no successors. They rebuilt no schools. They simply continued, professional to the end, knowing their profession would die with them. The Witchers had saved the northern kingdoms. This was documented fact. The contracts they had fulfilled, the monsters they had eliminated, the lives they had preserved through centuries of work. These contributions were recorded in ledgers and histories, acknowledged even by those who condemned what Witchers were and how they had been created. But the cost had been measured in thousands of children's deaths. The arithmetic that had once seemed to justify the trials, 30 children die so that 3 Witchers might be created, and those 3 Witchers save hundreds over their lifetimes. This calculation presumed that children were resources to be expended in service of greater numerical good. It treated them as means rather than ends, justified their suffering through outcomes they would never live to see. Whether alternatives had existed remained an open question. Could the post-conjunction crisis have been addressed without creating Witchers? Might other approaches, enhance conventional forces, focus magical research, negotiated withdrawals from monster-infested territories, have worked given sufficient time and resources? The kingdoms had chosen the Witcher solution not because it was the only option, but because it promised results within timeframes political stability demanded. This did not mean the choice was wrong, but it meant the choice had been exactly that. A decision made by those in power about what price in children's lives was acceptable to preserve civilization as they understood it. The Witchers themselves, those who survived to think about such questions, reached no consensus about their own existence. Some, particularly those trained in the Griffin tradition, clung to the belief that their suffering had meaning, that they had been guardians and protectors, that every child who died screaming in the trials had contributed to a legacy that saved countless innocent lives. This narrative helped them endure. Whether it was true in any sense beyond the subjective meaning it provided could not be objectively determined. Others, shaped by bear cat philosophies, rejected any attempt to frame their existence as noble or purposeful. They were weapons, tools, beings created for a function they performed competently until they died or became obsolete. The suffering had happened, the deaths had occurred. Trying to assign meaning to them was self-deception, a way to avoid confronting the brutal reality that they were accidents of history, given purpose by circumstance. The Wolf School Witchers, including Geralt, tended towards something between these extremes. They acknowledged what they were, and how they had been made without either celebrating or completely condemning it. They did the work because it needed doing and because they were capable of doing it. When they died, the work would stop being done. That was the reality they lived with, day by day, contract by contract, until the end. As the 12th century gave way to the 13th, the last witchers walked paths that were ending. The monsters remained. Drowners still lurked in rivers, ghouls still fed on the dead. Griffins still nested in mountain peaks and preyed on livestock and travelers. But the beings created specifically to hunt these threats were dying, their numbers diminishing with each passing year, with no possibility of replacement. Kaer Morhen stood in the mountains, cold and empty, except when Vesemir and the few surviving wolf witchers gathered there in winter. The laboratory vaults remained sealed, the degraded compounds within slowly losing potency, the knowledge of how to use them buried with those who had possessed it. The training grounds where generations of children had learned to fight monsters now saw only old men going through exercises more from habit than necessity. The other schools existed only as scattered remnants. Griffin witchers wandered alone. Cat witchers descended further into madness or died violently. Bears persisted in isolation. Vipers became myths. The unified vision that had briefly existed at Morgraig, the possibility of a cohesive order of monster hunters, had fragmented and died decades before the final destruction of the schools. The witchers had saved the northern kingdoms from the crisis that followed the conjunction. They had driven back the monsters, had made human civilization possible when it had stood on the edge of collapse. They had paid for this service with their humanity, their childhoods, their capacity for normal life. And they had done it knowing that most who attempted the transformation would die screaming. History would remember them, if it remembered them at all, as necessary monsters who hunted necessary prey. The judgment of whether their creation had been justified or monstrous would shift with perspective and time. Those who had lived through the post-conjunction crisis tended to view witchers as tragic but essential. Those born in later, safer times increasingly viewed them as abominations, proof of how far humans would go when driven by fear. Both perspectives held truth. The witchers had been necessary. They had also been atrocities. These statements were not contradictory, but complementary descriptions of the same historical reality. The northern kingdoms had needed them desperately, and had created them through processes that violated every principle of consent and human dignity. They had saved countless lives through their existence, and had built that existence on the corpses of children who had no choice in their transformation or destruction. This was their legacy, written in contracts fulfilled and graves unmarked, in kingdoms preserved and innocence destroyed, in monsters slain and children who died screaming in laboratories beneath ancient fortresses. The last witchers walked the path knowing that when they died, no one would follow. The profession would end. The schools would remain as ruins. The knowledge would be lost. The mutations would fade from living memory into legend and myth, and the monsters would remain, perhaps not in the numbers that had threatened civilization after the conjunction, but present nonetheless, waiting in the dark places for the protectors to finally disappear. Geralt of Rivia, training young Ciri in the ruins of Kaer Morhen, represented the absolute end of this tradition, teaching a child who had not undergone the trials because the trials could no longer be conducted, passing on sword skills and monster knowledge to someone who would never be a witcher, knowing this was as close as the tradition would come to continuation. The law of unintended consequences ruled all outcomes. The mages who created witchers to save civilization from monsters had created beings who would outlive the crisis that justified their existence. The kingdoms that had sponsored the experiments had produced defenders who would eventually be destroyed by the descendants of those they had saved. The schools that had jealously guarded their secrets had ensured those secrets would die with them, rather than persist in modified form. And the children who survived when 30 others died screaming had become legends and nightmares, heroes and abominations, saviors and cautionary tales about the prices humans would pay and extract when faced with an existential threat. 38 children had entered Rissberg Castle in the 10th century. 33 had died. 5 had survived to become the first witchers. From those 5, through centuries of continued trials and continued deaths, had emerged the defenders who saved the northern kingdoms from the horrors that came through the conjunction. And now, as the 13th century progressed, the last of those defenders grew old in a world that no longer wanted them, that had never really wanted them. that had only tolerated them because necessity temporarily outweighed revulsion. The ending was inevitable from the beginning, not because the Witchers failed at their purpose. They succeeded spectacularly, driven back threats that should have destroyed human civilization on the continent, but because they were never meant to persist beyond the crisis that created them. They were emergency measures, temporary solutions to problems that circumstances eventually made obsolete. That they had been made from children who screamed and died in the making was a cost the kingdoms had been willing to pay when the alternative was extinction. When that alternative receded, when the immediate threat diminished, the cost suddenly seemed excessive, monstrous, unacceptable in retrospect, though it had been accepted readily enough when desperation demanded it. This was the truth the last Witchers lived with. They had been needed desperately. They had also been convenient, and when they ceased to be convenient, when the threat they addressed became manageable through other means, they became embarrassments, reminders of what humans were capable of when frightened, evidence of moral compromises that looked very different when evaluated from positions of safety those compromises had helped create. The Witchers did not protest this. They did not demand gratitude or recognition. They simply continued walking the path, taking contracts, killing monsters, until they died, or the monsters did, or the world changed enough that neither mattered anymore. Their legacy was written not in monuments or histories, but in the empty spaces where monsters might have killed, but did not, because Witchers had been there. In the children who grew old, because drowners had been cleared from river crossings. In the villages that survived, because Griffin nests had been destroyed before they grew large enough to threaten settlement. These things were real, even if they were invisible. Lives saved that were never counted because the people living them never knew they had been in danger. Protection offered and accepted without acknowledgement, because that was the nature of the work. The Witchers had asked for nothing beyond payment for services rendered. They had received nothing beyond that payment, and often not even that. They had saved the world through their existence, and had built that existence on atrocity. Both things were true. Both would remain true long after the last Witcher died, and the knowledge of how to create more was lost beyond any possibility of recovery. The children of the Trial of the Grasses, those who survived when so many died, had fulfilled the purpose for which they were created. They had hunted monsters across the continent for centuries. They had protected people who feared and hated them. They had done this knowing they were tools, knowing they would be discarded, knowing their suffering would be forgotten or reinterpreted by those who benefited from what that suffering produced. And they had done it anyway, because the work needed doing and they were capable of doing it. This was their story, written in blood and alchemy and the screams of children in dark laboratories, written in contracts fulfilled and monsters slain and villages saved, written in the slow extinction of a profession that should never have needed to exist, but which saved the world nonetheless. The white-haired Witcher who would become legend, walking the path with his silver sword and his signs and his cat eyes, represented the absolute end of this tradition, the last generation, the final product of centuries of death and transformation. When Geralt died, no one would replace him. When the other survivors died, no one would replace them either. The Witchers would end. The knowledge would be lost. The schools would crumble to ruins. And the monsters would remain, waiting in the wild places, no longer facing the beings specifically created to hunt them. This was always how it was going to end. Not because the Witchers failed, but because they succeeded too well. They eliminated that crisis that justified their continued creation. They made the world safe enough that the cost of replacing them began to seem too high. So they walked the path knowing they were the last, that their profession died with them, that everything they had endured and everything the children who died screaming had suffered would fade into history and myth and eventually be forgotten entirely, except as cautionary tales about the prices desperate people will pay to survive. The arithmetic of the trials, 30 children dead for 3 who survive, haunted them when they allowed themselves to think about it. But most did not allow themselves to think about it. They simply continued, contract by contract, monster by monster, until they could not continue anymore and the path claimed them as it claimed everyone eventually. If you found value in this exploration of their history, in this accounting of what they were and how they came to be and what they cost, share this record with others who study such things. These stories deserve preservation even as the profession they describe fades into history. The Witchers saved the world. they were also atrocities. Both statements remain true, written in the bones of children who never had a choice and in the kingdoms that survived, because those children were transformed into weapons against the dark.